She looked at me across that dimly lit room and said, "You'll never forget tonight." I didn't know what she meant then, but I've remembered every second since. I wasn't supposed to be there that night. The invitation had come from a friend I hadn't seen in months, a casual message about an art exhibit he was helping organize. I'd almost said no. It was one of those cold evenings when even the air feels tired, and all I wanted was to stay home, pour a drink, and disappear into music. But something, boredom, curiosity, restlessness, made me go. The gallery was small, tucked between an old bookstore and a florist that was just closing up. Warm light spilled out through tall windows, soft and golden, like the glow of memory. Inside, voices mingled quietly under a slow jazz tune, the kind that seems to stretch time just enough for you to notice the details. The sound of heels on polished wood, the gentle clinking of glasses, the smell of paint and wine. That's when I saw her. Not at first, not in the way you notice someone instantly. It was subtler. I caught the sound of her laughter before I even turned toward her. It wasn't loud. It was low, controlled, the kind of laugh that carries warmth even when it's quiet. She stood a few steps away from one of the larger paintings, something abstract, blue and fractured, her arms folded loosely across her chest. There was nothing showy about her. No forced gestures, no pretending to be fascinated. Just stillness, the kind that draws your eyes without asking for them. When our gazes met, it wasn't dramatic. She just smiled, a small, knowing smile, like she already understood something about me. I remember looking away too quickly, pretending to study a sculpture beside me, though I couldn't tell you what it even looked like. Later, we found ourselves near the same table, reaching for the same glass of wine. Our fingers brushed, barely, just skin against skin for half a breath, enough to feel the warmth of her touch. She apologized softly, her voice calm and textured, the kind that makes you listen even when she's only saying a few words. We spoke only for a few minutes. About the art, about the weather, meaningless things that somehow didn't feel meaningless. Every time she looked at me, I felt something I couldn't quite name. A pull, gentle but unmistakable. When I left that night, the air outside felt different. Colder, maybe, or maybe I was just more aware of it. I walked home thinking about her, about how composed she seemed, how sure of herself, how her presence made everything around her feel quieter. I didn't know her name then, didn't know she'd changed the way I looked at closeness, or that her voice would echo in my head for weeks afterward. All I knew was that I'd almost skipped that night, and if I had, I never would have met the woman who would one day say, "You'll never forget tonight." It had been a week since that night at the gallery, and I'd almost convinced myself to stop thinking about her. Almost. The truth is, she'd stayed in my mind like the faint scent of perfume that lingers long after someone leaves a room. I didn't know her name, didn't know anything about her except the sound of her laugh and the calm in her eyes. But somehow, that was enough to make me notice her again, sitting alone under the awning of a small café one drizzling afternoon. The rain wasn't heavy, just steady. A silver curtain falling softly over the street. She sat by herself with a book open in front of her, though she wasn't reading it. Her fingers rested on the page, and she was watching the rain, like someone remembering something rather than observing it. I almost walked past. Felt too strange, too coincidental. But then she looked up, her eyes catching mine. Not surprised, just quietly pleased. She smiled and gestured toward the empty chair across from her, as if she'd been expecting me all along. "Still chasing art?" she asked, her tone light but her gaze steady. I smiled, nervous, trying to, I guess. Or maybe I'm just getting lost in it. She laughed. That same low, unhurried sound that had stuck with me. "Getting lost isn't the worst thing," she said, pushing the sugar jar toward me, though I hadn't ordered anything yet. "Sometimes it's the only way to find what matters." We talked for what felt like minutes but must have been hours. The world outside blurred, cars moving in soft focus, raindrops sliding down the awning's edge. Her stories carried weight. She spoke of cities she'd lived in, the music she used to play, the mistakes that had taught her gentleness. There was no pretense in her words. Everything she said had the ease of someone who'd already learned not to rush. When the waiter brought my coffee, our hands brushed again. Her skin warm against mine, my pulse stuttering at the contact. She didn't pull back quickly this time. Her eyes lingered on mine, and for a moment, I felt something wordless pass between us. Recognition, maybe, or a kind of understanding that doesn't need names. The rain softened. People began leaving the cafe one by one, until we were almost alone. The quiet between us wasn't awkward. It was full, alive. I realized I hadn't felt that kind of stillness in a long time, the kind that settles in your chest and makes you feel seen. When we finally stood to leave, she touched my sleeve lightly. "It's funny," she said, "how people meet twice before really seeing each other." I watched her walk away through the fading rain, her figure dissolving into the gray light of the afternoon. I didn't know what would come next, or if there would be a next, but I knew something had shifted. She wasn't just a stranger anymore. She was a presence I couldn't seem to forget. It was a Thursday evening when her message arrived. Short, uncomplicated. "You should come by tonight. It's nothing formal. Just music and good company." For a few seconds, I just stared at the screen, trying to convince myself it wasn't a mistake. But it was her, the woman from the gallery, from the rain-lit café, now inviting me into a space that felt like hers alone. I remember hesitating before typing my reply. There was no reason to say no, but my hands trembled anyway. There was something about her, a gravity that pulled at me and made everything else feel smaller, less certain. Her apartment was a short walk from mine, though I'd never noticed it before. A narrow building with ivy climbing the old brick, the kind of place that looked quietly lived in, not curated for anyone's approval. As I climbed the stairs, I could already hear faint music drifting through the slightly open door. Vinyl crackle, a slow jazz tune, the same warmth I'd felt in her voice. She opened the door before I could knock. "Hey," she said softly, like she'd been waiting just long enough for it to mean something. She was barefoot, wearing a loose gray sweater that hung just off one shoulder. Her hair was tied back, a few strands falling around her face. There was nothing deliberate about how she looked, and yet I couldn't imagine her any other way. Her apartment smelled faintly of cedar and wine, with hints of candle smoke and rain from the window she'd left cracked open. Books were everywhere, stacked on shelves, chairs, even the floor, and an old record player hummed in the corner. "Can I get you something?" she asked. "Just water's fine." She smiled at that, a small, amused curve of her lips, and poured 2 glasses anyway, handing one to me. Our fingers brushed again, familiar now but still charged. For a while we just talked. About music, about how the city feels different at night. She told me she liked quiet gatherings like this. No noise, no crowd, just the chance to see someone. There was a warmth to her words, a deliberate softness. She wasn't flirting in any obvious way. She was inviting me into something slower, something honest. At one point, she sat back on the couch, tucking one leg beneath her, and said, "You're younger than most people I let in here." I didn't know what to say, so I just looked at her. "Does that bother you?" She held my gaze for a long moment. "No," she said quietly. "It makes it harder to forget you." The room seemed to still then, the music, the rain outside, even the air. Before I left that night, she walked me to the door. The candlelight caught the gold flecks in her eyes, and she said, almost under her breath, "You'll never forget tonight." Her tone wasn't teasing. It was a promise. And somehow I already knew she was right. The night she invited me in felt suspended in its own kind of time. Hours passed, yet nothing seemed to move quickly. The music, slow and low, wrapped around us like a quiet heartbeat. Outside, the city murmured faintly, rain sliding down her window in thin, silver trails. We sat across from each other, the space between us filled with candlelight and the scent of red wine. She had changed the record, an old one, its edges slightly frayed, and as the melody swelled, she leaned back into the sofa, studying me with the kind of attention that feels like touch even from a distance. "You think too much," she said after a while. Her tone wasn't critical. It was soft, knowing. "Maybe," I admitted. "It's how I keep myself from saying the wrong thing." Her lips curved, that same small, half-amused smile. Sometimes silence says more than words. I remember nodding, pretending I understood, but in truth I didn't. Not until later. Because it was in that silence that everything between us began to shift. The conversation slowed. The air grew heavier, not with discomfort but with something unspoken, an awareness neither of us wanted to name too soon. I could hear the faint hum of the record spinning, the distant sigh of rain, the rhythmic tapping of her fingers against the arm of the couch. Every small sound seemed amplified, alive. When I looked at her, she was watching me. Not in a way that asked for anything, just seeing. And in her gaze, I felt an odd sense of calm, like she was teaching me how to be still. "I used to be like you," she said finally. "Always afraid of saying too much, feeling too much. Then one day I realized it was all slipping by anyway. The words, the people, the chances. So now," she paused, her eyes searching mine. "Now I just try to stay in the moment." Her voice carried a warmth that settled deep inside me. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words stayed trapped somewhere in my throat. Instead, I watched as she reached for her glass, her hand brushing mine in the space between us. It was a simple movement, yet it set something loose in me, something I hadn't known I'd been holding back. Her hand lingered, not in hesitation, but in quiet certainty, the kind that says this is enough. I could feel the faint tremor of her pulse beneath her skin, steady but alive. Neither of us moved to break the moment. The room seemed to breathe with us, a shared rhythm of closeness and restraint. I could feel the warmth from the candle, the softness of the light against her face, the rise and fall of her breath matching mine. And in that long pause between words, I understood what she meant. That silence, her silence, wasn't empty. It was full of everything we were too careful to say. The rain had stopped sometime after midnight, though neither of us had noticed. The air through her open window was cool and smelled faintly of wet stone and night-blooming flowers. The music had faded to a soft hum, one last track looping quietly in the background. She sat across from me, legs drawn up, her sweater slipping slightly down her shoulder. There was no pretense left between us. The easy talk about music and books had run its course. What remained was silence, the kind that asks for truth. She spoke first. "I wasn't planning to have anyone over tonight," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "I just didn't want to be alone." Something about the way she said it, calm but fragile, made me ache. There was no self-pity in her tone, just honesty. She stared at the candlelight flickering between us, her eyes reflecting it in soft gold. "I'm glad you called," I said quietly. She looked up, meeting my gaze, as if weighing whether to believe me. "Are you?" I nodded. "More than you probably think." For a long time, neither of us moved. I could hear the faint ticking of a clock somewhere behind me, steady and slow. I don't know what pushed me to speak next. Maybe the stillness, or maybe the way she was watching me, waiting. "I've been thinking about you," I said, "since the gallery, since the café. I don't really know why, but I can't seem to stop." Her lips parted slightly, not in surprise, but in something quieter. Understanding, maybe. "I know," she said after a moment. "I could feel it." She set her glass down and leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees. The light caught the small lines near her eyes, the kind that come from years of laughter and worry. "You remind me of someone I used to be," she said softly. "Hopeful, a little restless, scared of wanting too much." Her honesty cut through the air like a warm wind. I wanted to tell her that I wasn't scared, but that would have been a lie. I was, not of her, but of what she made me feel. When she reached across the space between us and brushed a drop of water from my hair, though there was no rain now, her hand trembled just slightly. Her fingertips lingered against my temple, and I felt my pulse race beneath her touch. "I don't know what this is," she said, her voice breaking faintly on the edges. "But I don't want to ruin it by naming it too soon." So I didn't answer. I didn't move. I just let the moment stay exactly as it was, raw, unfinished, whole. Her hand slid down to rest briefly against my cheek, then fell away. For a heartbeat, the world felt perfectly still. We didn't kiss. We didn't have to. That silence, that soft, trembling pause was the confession. And somehow it said everything we were both too afraid to say out loud. The clock on her wall showed just past 2 in the morning. Neither of us had mentioned the time. The candles had burned low, their wicks small and steady, and the room had fallen into that fragile kind of silence that only comes when a night is nearing its end. When you know you should leave, but something in you isn't ready to let go. She gathered the empty glasses and set them in the sink. The soft clink of glass echoed faintly in the kitchen, followed by the hush of running water. I stood by the window, watching the streetlights flicker against the damp pavement below. Every small sound, her movements, the creak of the floorboards, seemed sharper, more deliberate, like the world was asking me to remember it exactly as it was. When she came back into the room, she leaned against the doorframe, arms folded lightly. Her expression was calm, but her eyes gave her away. They held that same quiet sadness I'd seen at the café. The look of someone who's learned to hide loneliness behind grace. "It's late," she said softly. I nodded, though neither of us moved. "Yeah. You should get going before the trains stop." Her voice was kind, but there was something underneath it, something that made my chest tighten. I stepped closer, close enough to see the faint shimmer of candlelight reflecting on her skin. "I don't want to leave yet," I said. The words came out quieter than I meant them to. She looked at me for a long time, then smiled. A small, tired smile that felt almost like surrender. "You don't have to decide what this means tonight," she said. "Sometimes it's enough just to feel it." There was nothing I could say to that. She was right, she always seemed to be. She walked me to the door, her steps slow, almost reluctant. The air between us felt heavier with every one of them. When we reached the threshold, she reached up and brushed her fingers along my shoulder. A gesture so light it almost didn't feel real. "You're kind," she said quietly. "Don't let the world take that from you." Her touch lingered just a second longer than it needed to. My hand found hers almost without thinking. Our fingers brushed. A single, quiet connection, but neither of us pulled away. For that one heartbeat, the world felt suspended again, like the space between us was holding its breath. I could have kissed her then. Maybe part of me wanted to, but something about the moment felt too fragile, too sacred to break with anything less than silence. So instead I said, "Good night." She smiled again, softer this time. "Good night," she whispered, and when I stepped into the cool night air, I realized it didn't feel like an ending. Not really. It felt like the pause between heartbeats, the kind that reminds you something still lingers, quietly alive, waiting to be remembered. It wasn't goodbye. Not yet. Days passed, then weeks. The city slipped back into its usual rhythm. Trains sighing through the night, streetlights humming faintly, strangers brushing past without a word. Yet everything felt slightly altered, as if some invisible thread in me had been pulled just enough to change the way I noticed the world. I hadn't seen her since that night. We hadn't made plans, hadn't promised to call. There were no unfinished words left hanging between us. Only silence, soft and full, like the one she'd taught me to listen to. Still, I found her everywhere. In the quiet of early mornings, when light poured through my window just the way it had through hers. In the scent of coffee and rain outside the cafe where I'd first seen her again. In the sound of old jazz songs, each one carrying a trace of her voice, her laughter, her stillness. I tried to tell myself it had been a small moment, just one night, but that wasn't true. It had been more than that. She hadn't just entered my life. She'd rearranged the way I experienced it. Before her, I'd moved through my days half asleep, rushing, talking, filling silence because I didn't know how to sit inside it. She changed that. She showed me that stillness isn't emptiness, that a moment can be full without needing to lead anywhere. One afternoon, I found myself walking past that same cafe. The air smelled of rain again, and the awning dripped gently onto the tables outside. For a second, I almost expected her to be there. Her book open, her fingers resting on the page, her eyes lifting to meet mine like it was the most natural thing in the world. She wasn't, of course, but I smiled anyway, because even in her absence, she'd become part of the way I saw things. The way I noticed small details, the reflection of light on wet pavement, the warmth of a stranger's kindness, the quiet grace in fleeting moments. It all carried her imprint, like the afterglow of a candle long extinguished. Sometimes I wonder if she ever thinks of me, if that night lingers for her, too. But I don't need to know. The truth is simpler, quieter. She gave me something that didn't fade with time. When she said, "You'll never forget tonight," I thought she meant the candlelight, the rain, the closeness. But she'd meant something else. She'd meant the feeling of being seen, fully without fear or hurry, and how once you've felt that, you can't go back to the way things were before. I still hear her voice sometimes, low and certain, "You'll never forget tonight." And she was right, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was real, beautifully, painfully real. Leave a comment, share this story with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe for more slow burn stories about love, memory, and the moments that never leave us.